Welcome to the number one podcast covering Michigan State basketball. The Final Four is not on the schedule. Join Rod and me, Eric, as we dive deep into the Spartans to get you prepared for every game. Subscribe today for in-depth recruiting updates and fantastic interviews with today's important college basketball personalities like Robbie Hummel.
Thanks for having me. I have listened to your guys' podcast numerous times on drives throughout any Midwestern Big Ten city. So I am big fans of your guys' work.
Jay Billis.
And next time, hey, if anybody in Michigan wants a December tea time, call me. You wimps won't show up, but I'll be there. I'll be there and play in the cold. And Izzo will be in front of the fire with hot chocolate.
Coaches Thomas Kelly.
No problem. Glad to be back, man. Glad to be back.
Mike Garland.
Just can't sit there and trade twos for threes. You can't do it. You're gonna lose. Coming down the stretch, you're gonna lose.
And more. You won't find better coverage of Spartan hoops than you will get here. For both the casual and hardcore fan, come along as we take you for a green and white ride. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod as we've reached the conclusion of our Big Ten team previews, minus Michigan State. Today is number one Purdue, who Rod thinks will repeat as Big Ten champs. I would like to remind you that we do have the Beat Rod contest where you go up against Rod and the rest of our listeners. $100 to the first place with Wonderful Nudge Printing. Send along your predictions to me at Eric, at ERIC, at TFFINOTS.com. So the rank of the orders 1 through 18 with your name and total number of points Michigan State scores against Wolverines as a tiebreaker. And recall, they do play twice this season. The entries are due before the first Big Ten game, which is played in December. So I'll remind you before, but it's best to get them in right now if you can. If you do enjoy the show and want to help us reach other Spartans, please continue to spread the word about it to friends and family. Consider recurring or even one-time gift on Patreon or Substack. Head on over to thefinalfoursontheschedule.com/support for the necessary links. All right, so let's talk about the Edey list, Boilermakers, and last year's national runners-up to UConn. Last year the Boilermakers finally did good, or Matt Painter finally sort of got to the promised land. He got to the Final Four, got them all to the national title game. Obviously, they ended up losing there to UConn, who was a really good team. They won their back-to-back Big Ten titles and won it running away this year as opposed to the previous year. So it was a no-doubter this year. They went 34-5 last year overall, 17-3 in the Big Ten. And I think, especially after the previous season, I should say, lost in the first round to a 16 seed. They made up for that and made all the way to the national title game and just fell short. So, great season for the Boilermakers, obviously. And for as much as they've had regular season success, they've not had the postseason success in the past. And so for them, that's got to be a gigantic, monkey off their back. Was it 1980s or something since they last had a Final Four appearance?
Actually, 1980.
Yeah, 1980.
The first year of the 80s. And so you think about this, Gene Cady, who is a Hall of Fame, I believe he's in the Basketball Hall of Fame now. Certainly a Hall of Fame worthy coach, and who was there forever, who had, I think it was probably, I'm going to guess, about a 25-ish year run at Purdue, somewhere in that neighborhood. Never made a Final Four. I believe only got to the Elite Eight once with Big Dog Robinson.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty sure. No, check that. He did it twice because he did it again in 2000, the year MSU won the title, losing to Wisconsin in a regional final. So he did it twice. That alone tells you this wasn't just a Matt Painter thing, although that mattered too.
Sure.
It's the guy before him who was there forever and had incredible regular season success also could not get to a Final Four. So to finally do it, and it's hard to say. Look, I'm sure Purdue fans, there's a lot of disappointment around last season in the sense that whenever you get to the title game, you feel like you ought to win it.
Yeah, right.
That's a missed opportunity if you don't. Unless you're in a scenario where you're just facing, kind of like the one Michigan State had in 2009, where I have to be honest, I look back at that game and I don't feel a great deal of disappointment because Carolina was so good that year, and you just sort of knew that Michigan State was going to have, it was just going to have to be one of those days for it to go their direction. And that didn't happen. I don't think Purdue was in quite that scenario with UConn last year. UConn was very, very good, but I don't think if I were a Purdue fan, I wouldn't have come away from that game feeling like, well, guys, great season, but we just had no chance. I mean, I think they're probably disappointed. But all that said, Purdue's in a very different situation than Michigan State as a program.
Yeah.
And I think for a Purdue fan, you have to take some satisfaction, a lot of satisfaction, out of finally making good on expectations based on regular season success and where you were ranked and expectations for what you would do when you were in the tournament and all of that. It's hard. I would think it's hard to be too upset about what happened. And, and we said it going in the last season. And it was, for me, it was one of the few question marks around that team was their whole thing now is based around what they do in March.
Yeah, right.
And I wondered, is that maybe going to take a little bit of the edge off for them in the regular season? And as it turns out, that was not the case. They were once again locked in, were great from start to finish, lapped the Big Ten for a second year in a row. So they displayed a remarkable amount of focus in terms of the entirety of the season. And that is a difficult thing to do. We have seen on occasion, not as much as I see some people who like to think in cliches that don't actually withstand scrutiny like to think, but there have been a couple of occasions where we've seen Michigan State teams with immense expectations coming into a season and based on the previous year's success, and they just never quite get that edge, or they don't get it until late. I actually think the 2009-2010 team was an example of that. That team, people forget, coming off the appearance in the title game the year prior and with a ton back, I think Michigan State was as good a pick as anyone to win the national title that year.
Mm-hmm.
And although they won a share of the Big Ten, if you go back and you look at how they were perceived during that season, there was a lot of concern that they were not going to have the kind of run that they had had the year prior. That was seen as a little bit of a disappointing team. And then ironically, Kalen Lucas gets hurt and they end up going on a run anyway and could have won the whole thing because that was a weak Final Four.
Yeah. And
a bad non-call on a Draymond Green jumper, and then if they'd won that game as they should have against Butler, they would have faced a Duke team that frankly is the worst Duke team to win a national title out of all of them that K ever had. And I think Michigan State could have had it. But my point is that team actually, I don't think was quite as sharp throughout most of that season. They found themselves in time, but so it happens. And the fact that did not happen to Purdue, that they basically checked every box except for winning the last game, is impressive.
Yeah.
And, kudos to them. Kudos to Matt Painter. They now don't have to hear any talk about, 5 generations since they were in a Final Four or any of that. They've done it. And you're now turning the page because, as we're going to talk about in some detail in a second, you are definitely in a before and after BC AD kind of situation with Zach Edey departing. There's no two ways about it. Not just that he was a great player. That's enough in and of itself. But as we spent a lot of time talking about the last 2 years, he was a freakish great player in the sense that he sucked up all the oxygen. He was the center of gravity on every court he was on the last 2 years, and it changed the way Purdue played. It changed the way opponents had to play Purdue, and it's just not going to be the same. Yes, they've got 7-foot-plus guys still on the roster. I expect them to have at least solid, if not better than that, play inside, but it isn't going to be what Zach Edey gave them.
Right.
So we are definitely in an after scenario this year, and it'll be interesting to see how Purdue manages to make that adjustment.
Yeah, I was just looking up on the previous NCAA tournament appearances. I did not even remember Lee Rose as the coach, but that was the 19...
briefly. The 1980 team was,
yep,
it was headed by Joe Barry Carroll.
Okay.
Who was their big man, who was also in the NBA was known as Joe Barely Cares. He was a better college player than a pro player. Let's put it that way.
And so then we have Elite 8 appearances by Katie in 93-94, and then 99-2000. And then they really faded away until Painter took over in 2005-06 season, which they were terrible. They were 3-13 in the Big Ten, but then bounced back right away.
Painter had only been to one Elite 8 prior to last year.
Yes.
He had that team, if you remember, in 19 that should have beaten Virginia.
Yep.
With Carson Edwards.
Yeah, they had him on the ropes for sure. Well, they had their game one. It just collapsed. Yeah, that's interesting because we've always talked about how that team is so different, like at odds with all the recent sort of Matt Painter Purdue teams that you had.
That year, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's why it was one of the few objectively entertaining Purdue teams to watch play.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we're moving into a new era. And so let's begin by talking about players departing and cleaning the house. Brought to you by the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. If you need your house cleaned, you need your windows cleaned, you don't like the birds too much, that you want them crashing your windows, there's no better way than have them nice and clean and clear. So contact the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. They are very obviously in Grand Rapids, but they're a very large region. They go as far as the capital and the state. They cleaned up the state house. And they also can get anywhere around the west side of the state. So check them out. They've got great pricing. You get 15% off as a listener to the show if you just mention Final Four when you get your estimate. They are meticulous, very friendly, and like I said, great pricing. They do just an incredible job. They also can power wash your house, and not just your house. It can be a commercial realty property. It can be high rise. It can be apartment building. It can be your business. Whatever you need cleaned up, they can take care of it. So contact the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. You won't regret it. Call them today. You'll be glad you did. All right. So first person, probably the last person you talk to almost in some ways, is Zach Edey, the number one back-to-back national player of the year, Big Ten MVP, obviously. Averaged 25.2 points a game, 12.2 rebounds a game, 2.2 blocks a game, shot 62% from the floor, and an impressive 71% from the line. He averaged a little over 11 free throws a game, attempts a game. And, inside a few feet, he was basically automatic 2 points. And probably the most impressive thing about that actually is how many minutes a game he played. I don't have it in front of me, but he must have averaged close to 30. I mean, probably high 20s in a game. So that was probably the most important. The endurance is a thing that really separated him and made it so you always had to deal with him in your on both ends of the court. So in that sense, glad he's gone, but he's a big, huge loss for Purdue, and they'll obviously be a totally different team this year.
Look, and I try to make sure that I'm not injecting this with any sense of homerism, but as a Michigan State fan, the homer part is you're glad to see him gone because he was an extremely effective weapon, and he generally played very, very well against Michigan State. They tried to deal with him different ways over the years and without a lot of success.
Right.
As a basketball fan, I'm glad to see him gone because, and I said this at when we were talking about him as an active player at Purdue, I don't blame him. I don't blame Matt Painter. If you've got that guy, you have to use him basically the way Matt Painter used him. No objection to that. But as a basketball fan, objectively, it was murder to watch. It was just ugly. It really was. And it's because, you have people giving officials a bailout saying, well, you can't really officiate a guy that size. I don't accept that. But the reality is he was officiated very poorly and mostly to his and Purdue's advantage, in my view, trying to be as objective as I can be. But what I think is beyond argument, what is clearly just fact, is that his style of play, the way Purdue had to use him, it made for unattractive basketball. That's not what people want to watch. I'm just sorry. I'm convinced of that, unless you're a Purdue fan. And I don't blame Purdue fans because the bottom line is they want to see their team win. Yeah. But as a neutral fan, I don't want to watch that. And I don't get me wrong. I love post play. I am not one of these guys that revels in what the NBA has largely become, which is a game where you don't see a lot of post play. I love great post play, great footwork, moving the ball, passing out of double teams, all of that. Great touch. But that wasn't Edey.
Yeah.
Edey was just brute force and size. And that's not fun. To give him his credit as a player, I think he did, at least between 2 years ago and last year, he at least marginally improved his ability to move. That goes along in part with what you said about his endurance, which I totally agree. Never, 2 years ago, if you had told me that guy would be able to play anywhere close to the way he did playing the minutes that he played, I never would have believed it.
Yeah.
It is a remarkable feat, and he is to be given credit, and Purdue is to be given credit as a program for getting him to the point that he could play that many minutes. Now, that said, they did things to help him do that. They don't run. They largely tried to have him shack ball screens, playing drop coverage. They weren't asking him to move as much as, say, a big man at Michigan State is asked to move. But again, the fact that they did it, even considering all of that stuff, is impressive. I'd say the other area he really improved in last year that maybe didn't get as much credit, he averaged 2 assists per game to 2.3 turnovers a game. Now, that's not going to make anybody forget Caleb Swanigan at Purdue, but it was much improved from the prior year. If you remember, we spent a lot of time talking about how Northwestern in particular had really found something of a blueprint. And hey, you just harass him. You double, you triple him, you send guys from the perimeter on digs, you disrupt him, you might force a mistake, and at the very least you're gonna break up their timing and then put it on their guards. Well, last year that wasn't as effective a strategy against Purdue. Edey was better. And all of that actually helped him do something else that I don't think anybody believed would be possible even heading into last season, which is become a lottery pick.
Yeah.
In the NBA draft. I don't think anybody saw that coming, but his season was so impressive that it made believers of people in a league that really in the modern era does not lend itself to guys who play the way he does. And I think what changed is people said, well, he's at least been able to make marginal improvements in areas of weakness, and his strengths are almost unstoppable.
Yeah.
So I would say my bottom line is this. He was not a flawless player, but he was the single biggest weapon in the college game, and I would argue the biggest gravitational force college basketball has had in years. I'd have to really think about it to figure out when we last saw a guy who could dominate a game the way he did at the college level. It's been a long, long time. That doesn't even necessarily, I don't even necessarily think that means he was the quote-unquote best player. But, it's like Shaquille O'Neal used to say this about himself. He used to refer to himself as the most dominant. That doesn't necessarily mean you're the best,
right,
but it does mean you impose yourself on a game in a more profound way than anybody else. And I think that's a pretty good descriptor of what Zach Edey was. He changed every game he played in. And I think, and I alluded to this a few minutes ago, Matt Painter has made a career out of taking outsized big men. And he's got more on the roster this year, guys we'll talk about. He will continue, I'm sure, to recruit those kind of players, and some of them will probably be very good. But I think it's highly unlikely he's ever going to have another one who impacts the game the way Zach Edey did. That seems very unlikely.
Yeah, I mean, when's the last Magic Johnson Michigan State's had, right? It's been some...
Right, and that's a really good comparison point in this sense. Have there been great creators and playmakers? Yeah, tons of them. But there haven't been any 6'9" guys
right,
who did that. So we're going to say, well, yeah, are there going to be other great centers? Are there even going to be other 7-foot-plus great centers at Purdue? Probably. But is there going to be a Zach Edey? Is there going to be a 7'5" guy? No. Probably not.
All right, so let's move away from, if we can sort of overcome his gravitational pull, and we'll move away from him and move on to Lance Jones, 6'1" transfer from Southern Illinois. Nice year. Especially, I feel like he came on late a little bit more too, but he averaged almost 12 points a game, shot 41, 36, and 74. And he was a nice veteran in the backcourt with Smith and Lawyer, who at times would, I think, certainly they looked like they were going to struggle more looking at what happened with them as freshmen, but I think he's a good steadying force for them in the backcourt.
He was, I'll give Painter credit for that one too. I did not think he would work out the way he did. His career at Southern Illinois did not suggest to me that he would be the offensive player at Purdue that he was. The fact that he shot 36% on threes, averaged almost 12 a game, that caught me by surprise. The defense, the kind of steady presence, secondary ball handler, that didn't surprise me so much. But I did not think he would be as successful offensively. And he was a really, I mean, it gets lost in the Edey discussion, but Lance Jones was a big reason they had the season they did. I felt it really solidified that team.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. There's no way to know, but what effect shooting numbers and your effectiveness offensively is affected by Edey. I mean, obviously it is, but how much did he contribute to that? I mean, does Lance Jones shoot 30% with a regular team versus a guy who's always forcing double teams? Where now who knows?
One thing you can say. And I think this is a good discussion. Normally, generally speaking, I think the reason that we frequently see guys who are transferring up struggle to match their shooting at their previous stop once they get to a league like the Big Ten is a pretty simple thing. The Big Ten, you have generally better athletes who are prepared better because the coaching is a little better. And so shot windows close a little more quickly. I mean, it's a simple explanation. It doesn't hold true 100% of the time, but I think it's got a lot to do with it. But when you're playing with a guy like Edey, those windows are wide open every game because teams simply cannot simultaneously deal with him and consistently get to the shooters on the perimeter to challenge the way they otherwise would if they were playing another team. So I think that probably does have something to do with it. But the bottom line is, even an open shot, you still got to hit them.
Yeah.
And Lord knows we saw Purdue struggle to do that at times the year previous. So still credit to Jones for having the year he had.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was the story the first round of the tournament the year before, right? I mean, wide open shots and missing
100%. Yeah. 100%.
Moving on then to Mason Gillis, 6'6" forward, averaged 6.5 points a game, a little under 4 rebounds a game in 21 minutes. He didn't start after the beginning of the season, but he still shot really well, 48, 47, 86. He's going to finish his COVID year at Duke, which, it's not exactly a step down.
I didn't delve real deeply into the reasons why, and sometimes it can just be as simple as saying you want a change of scenery. It's a funny thing. You don't ever hear it really, or at least not that often in American sports, but it's a big thing in soccer. You will see guys who at a certain point in their career will just decide to go play in another country because they just want to experience different culture. They just want something different. They want to play in a different league. They want to live in a different country, and they just go. And it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with, the usual motivators like more money on offer or, a better chance to win a championship.
Playing time or whatever. Maybe,
none of those things. There were guys will say that. They'll say I'm just at a certain point in my career, I just want to experience something different. And I wonder if that's Mason Gillis' thing or if he's been frustrated that he wasn't a starter. I mean, Mason Gillis, you look at the efficiency stats, he had a hell of a year.
Yeah.
48, 47, 86 is killing it. And Mason Gillis can guard people. He's tough. I mean, the rebounding numbers, the raw numbers don't jump out at you, but I think he's a decently effective rebounder too. I don't get it. I would think, to me, if you were Matt Painter, you'd be pulling out all the stops to keep Mason Gillis, and they didn't. And he's at Duke, I'm not quite sure why, because I say it could just be wanted to change the scenery. Could be he felt like he still wasn't going to get a chance to start. I think he's in line. I think he's expected to start at Duke. But regardless, it's a loss for Purdue because if they had him back, I think they'd be a better team.
Moving on then to salty Ethan Morton, 6'5" wing, averaged a little under a point a game, 1.1 assists per game, a little under a rebound a game in 10 minutes. He shot 24, 21, and 57, despite his sophomore that he shot really well and just been terrible ever since. Defensively, fantastic, but just a liability on the offensive end and pretty terrible. I mean, he could even, that's the class he couldn't throw it in the ocean. So he's going to take off and he's going to do his COVID year at Colorado State, which is maybe not that much of a surprise.
Yeah. He was the guy that got impacted by Lance Jones, and it's one reason why I think their team last year was actually better than the one the year prior, is I think Lance Jones, despite being a very different player, 4 inches smaller, Lance Jones could give you, he wasn't quite as versatile a defender as Morton, but Lance Jones was still really good defensively and vastly better on offense. So if you're looking for one separator between the team 2 years ago and last year's team, that positional upgrade was it. Ethan Morton started 29 times, averaged 25 minutes a game 2 years ago. So he lost 15 minutes a game in playing time over 1 year to the next. And I think unquestionably it was the right decision. You said he had that 1 year, sophomore year, where he actually shot the ball well. Other than that, the other 3 years, he was not just bad. I mean, he was abysmal.
Yeah.
And so that's a limiter, You want somebody, ideally, who's at least a quasi-threat. And he just wasn't even that. So made sense for Purdue to change his role. I think it makes sense for Morton to transfer out, play a year at Colorado State, which, by the way, it has been and likely will continue to be a very good program.
Sure. Yeah.
And in a good league. And so he'll have a chance, I imagine, to get back to the NCAA tournament again, but playing a bigger role than he would have at Purdue.
Well, what is a shocking turn of events? We've only gone through 4 players who are departing and not returning next year, and we're done for a Big Ten team. That has been pretty unusual. That's almost like normal for regular year. So that Purdue is outside the norm.
Look, there's 2 teams in the conference that operate this way. It's Purdue and Michigan State. But that's, Matt Painter, clearly he will go into the portal just like Tom Izzo will. I mean, Lance Jones was a portal guy and a very good addition. But his preference is to, just like Tom Izzo's, is to recruit kids from high school and develop them over time. That has been the way that the program at Michigan State has operated, and it has been the way that the program in West Lafayette has operated. So no surprise in that, and no surprise that it looks like it's going to continue that way.
Yeah, one would expect. All right, so let's talk about the returning players brought to you Nudge Printing. If you need Spartan apparel, whether it's hockey, football, basketball, whatever sport it is, there's no better place to go than Nudge Printing. That's where our family gets all kinds of stuff. I just got my daughter a bunch of stuff now that she's walking around campus. And again, as a student, it's a lot easier for her to have some green and white. So she's really enjoying her hoodie, and she's got like a little zip-up coat, which she loves. And so they're fantastic stuff, super comfortable, lightweight, very breathable, and high quality screen printing, so it lasts a lot of washes. And so you can't go wrong going to Nudge Printing. They also have really cool custom hats. Check out their mesh hats. They're all the various designs on it too. So the nice thing about Nudge Printing is they've got vintage and they've got sort of the current sort of logos. So you can get kind of whatever you want there. Also, they have wall stickers, stuff for cornhole, and also then lots of other different teams. Most of the schools in the state of Michigan, and then also some random state schools around the state. And the one I'm not allowed to mention in the Big Ten because of my son is Indiana. He also has Indiana stuff. So head on over to Nudge Printing, 20% off. You type in Final Four just as one word at the checkout. You can find out more about it at the Final Fours on schedule.com/support. All right, so first returning player, probably the most important one, is the point guard, Braden Smith, 6 foot. He'll be a junior now. He averaged 12 points a game, 5.8 rebounds a game, which I think is one of the things that's very impressive, that he almost 6 rebounds a game. Yep. 7.5 assists per game to 2.7 turnovers a game. He shot 44, 43, and 80. The only thing I'd say, it'd be interesting to see what his assist to turnover ratio is next season, where he's not tossing to a guy who's, a foot and a half from the basket and just like drops it in.
Yeah. It's also worth mentioning that he not only was on the preseason All Big Ten team, he is the pick for Big Ten Player of the Year. I'm going to bet against his winning that.
Yeah, me too.
I'm not necessarily going to bet against him being a first-team all-conference choice. I think that's possible.
Right.
But look, he's confounded me throughout pretty much all of his first 2 years. So who am I to bet against this guy? You mentioned the rebounding numbers, and this is almost sacrilegious for me to say this, because the guy I'm going to compare him to is definitely, when push comes to shove, one of my 3 favorite guys to ever play at Michigan State, and that's Scott Skiles. But he really does. I haven't yet seen the kind of FU in him that drove Skiles, but he's got 2 years to get that chip on his shoulder. But those rebounding numbers, if you go back and look at the senior season Scott Skiles had, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I want to say it was around 5 a game. And Skiles was, basically the same size as Braden Smith, maybe even a little less gifted athletically, but close. But a guard that size, averaging those kind of numbers, more than anything else, to me, you can talk about toughness and all that, but I think what it really tells you about is their instinct for the ball, their ability to anticipate, because that can sometimes overcome superior athleticism. Frequently it does. If you can outthink the opponent by just being able to know where that ball is going to go a beat quicker than they do, it may not matter that they'd whip your ass in a 40, Yeah. And I think for a guy that size, it's really the only way that you can be putting up numbers like that. Then you look at the way Braden Smith, his assist numbers, as you say, he's going to be playing a different game this year, but it's still impressive. And the fact that he can shoot, he really does more than, I can't think of another guy who's come through the league that reminds me more of Skiles than Braden Smith. Not exactly, but close enough. Now, what's going to be interesting is, over his last 2 years, if he can take the jump the way Scott did to become a big-time scorer, even when he is now the top guy on the opponent's scouting report, because he hasn't gone through that yet. And that's the jump. When the other team is prepping for you more than anybody else, and you still go out and bust them for 20 plus a night, that's when I think it will really come into focus that, he's that kind of player. But as I say, certain elements of what he does and what he is do bring that to mind. It's also worth mentioning, and again, we all understand he's had the bonus of playing with a player like Edey, but he's recorded the second most assists through a sophomore season in Big Ten history. The only guy ahead of him is Irvin Johnson, and he was actually just slightly ahead of Cassius Winston, who's in third. That is impressive. Edey or no, that's impressive. Right. And so I think you can say through 2 years, what he's proven is that he thinks the game at a high level, and he's capable of getting better, of refining his skills. His three-point shooting went up 5% between his freshman and sophomore year. That's a pretty big jump. Now, even 38% as a freshman was pretty good, but 43, you're getting into another level. Mm-hmm. So I think that the question at this point, which we've kind of been discussing, is, okay, now that you're the guy at the top of the scouting report, how effective are you, one, in that role, and two, without a great freakish player like Edey to play off of? That's the next hurdle for Braden Smith. But I'm not about to say that he can't do it.
No, I think it'd be foolish at this point to say that he can't, because I think, one of the things that looked like in the blueprint for shutting down Purdue last year was really getting into Braden Smith. And I do think that was somewhat effective last year, but not nearly as much as it was his freshman year. And so he was able to overcome that. And so, that just shows some growth, and certainly worries to be, things to be concerned about next season.
100%. That was the game plan, was get into their guards, him as the primary ball handler especially, and make them beat you. And I thought over the course of last season, Braden Smith showed maturation and improvement in that area, and so we'll see if he's got another level, because he's going to need to. If he comes back and he's just the same guy he was last year, he'll be fine, but that won't be enough for Purdue. They need him to be better.
Yep. And his bosom buddy, Fletcher Lawyer, 6'5" junior, averaged 10.3 points a game, 42, 44, and 86 in his shooting. He's definitely better consistently from deep throughout the season. Still has a risk of falling over from a stiff breeze, but he can't defend, but he can sure draw a lot of charges.
Yeah, the biggest thing with him is that shooting percentage from deep went way up.
Yeah.
As a freshman, I think he got off to a hot start, and his jumper looks pretty, and that overrode a lot of the reality for a lot of fans, I think, because when you looked at where his shooting numbers ended up, it was not great. But last year, that slump just never came. 44% from three. And the thing is, though, he's got to give them that, because if he doesn't give them that, I don't know that you can justify playing him starters minutes, because he is weak defensively. I have my doubts as to whether we're going to see significant improvement. I'll buy that he can get a little better as he gets a little stronger and a little more experienced, but Fletcher Lawyer is never going to be a really good defender. He's just not. And he's not much of a rebounder. I don't think that's likely to change. It's basically shoot or bust.
Yeah.
He's got to be able to hit threes. And if he does, then he's a weapon, and then it's justified playing him those minutes. If he doesn't, if he were to revert to his freshman year, I think Purdue has other answers now that they maybe didn't have 2 years ago, and you might see his role shrink. So it really comes down to the shooting with him.
Yeah, he certainly strikes me as a guy who is not strong handling the ball either, just because he's not strong in general.
Right.
And I mean, if he was on Iowa's team, he'd totally be at home. That's totally where I imagine him almost being more than even at Purdue.
The weaknesses wouldn't matter.
Yeah, right, exactly. Then we go to Trey Kaufman-Wren, a player I really like, 6'9", 220-pound sophomore. Averaged 6.5 points a game, 4 rebounds a game, shot 51, 33, and 56, started every game. And, I suppose you could envision him playing the 5 at times too, with the ability to shoot outside a little bit, but he'll probably play the 4 most of the season, I would think.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that goes. I kind of lean toward that, because you just feel like when Matt Painter has a couple of 7-foot-plus options on his roster, he's going to use it. Yeah. I mean, seriously. But I think we will see Wren at the 5 at times. But whichever position he's playing, I think you're likely to see a significant upgrade in his role. He was an interesting case. Very highly regarded recruit who redshirted as a freshman. Then the next year, which was 2 years ago, or last year, I'm sorry, he came in as a redshirt freshman and kind of leapfrogged Gillis. He was the reason that Gillis's role sort of declined a little bit, and why Gillis wasn't a starter is they were opting to start Kaufman-Wren. I mean, he started all 39 games. He's a talented kid, and you could see flashes of that last year. I think he's got an ability to potentially be a very good post player. I don't think he was last year, but you saw flashes of it. And yet he's also got some face-up game. He can shoot. He can hit a 3. He can hit a mid-range shot. So I expect that, not that any one guy is going to replace Edey's production. There's no way that happens. But he will be part of what they try to do in rejiggering their offense. And I think you'll probably see him operate at both post spots, maybe more 4 than 5, but I think you'll see him at both. And I won't be surprised if his numbers tick up substantially.
Next returning player is Miles Colvin, very athletic, 6'5" sophomore. He averaged 3.3 points a game, shot 44, 41, and 50, and very limited volume. Obviously, just played 9 minutes a game, but played in almost every game. People may recall preseason, he was in some dunk contest with Cone Carr. I mean, he just showed off his athleticism there very well. I mean, Carr was a little bit more explosive, but still very impressive athlete.
Super impressive. And he's a guy that I think is set to take a big step forward potentially. You know, not heavy volume, as you mentioned, but whenever I saw him, particularly later in the year, I thought he looked very much at home. He looked comfortable shooting the ball, which was, if there was a question mark about him, at least early, it was going to be that. And, 44, 41, pretty impressive.
Yeah.
I think he's got to be in there competing for a starting wing spot. I don't know that I definitely expect him to win it because Cam Edey, who we'll talk about next, is stiff competition. But, boy, if I'm Matt Painter, I'm really excited by what a sophomore Miles Colvin could do because he gives them an element that Purdue just has not had very much of over the years. Matt Painter's teams have generally, on the wings, have had guys that were very strong defensively, oftentimes could shoot the ball well, but he hasn't had big-time athletes very much. Jaden Ivey is the one guy in recent years that sort of broke the mold for Purdue, and you saw how well they used him as he developed. I don't know that I expect Miles Colvin to take a similar jump as a sophomore the way Jaden Ivey did, but I do think he's got elements to his game physically that are not common for Purdue teams. And so that would be exciting if I were Matt Painter to have the opportunity to inject some of that. I mean, it doesn't mean they're going to be playing a 94-foot game very often, but you can find ways for a guy like that to really impact what you do.
Then we have Cam Edey, 6'7" sophomore, averaged 3.3 points a game, 1.9 rebounds a game, played about 12 minutes, shot 58, 45, and 73. And, they have a lot of young players that were actually very impressive and effective, which was, helped obviously last season offload some of those minutes.
Now, as you mentioned when we were talking about Lance Jones, the shooting numbers, okay, we have to recognize that's coming in an Edey-centric offense. So might we see some regression with some of these guys based on that and also just higher volume?
Yeah.
Possible. But Cam Edey impressed the heck out of me last year as well.
Yeah.
I think he's potentially a very good player. He's even bigger than Colvin at 6'7", and yet he too, very good athlete. Obviously, you shoot 58% overall, 45% from three. That tells you something. That this is another guy. Those two guys, Colvin and Edey, I think could really change things for Purdue. And again, if one of them starts, one of those two guys is going to start. The other one, I think that's where Foster Loyer really has to keep his shooting up. Fletcher, sorry. I know that was inevitable. Because if Fletcher Loyer doesn't shoot as a 40% plus guy, boy, I mean, just for me, I might feel as if I'm having a harder and harder time justifying playing him minutes over the one of these two guys we just discussed who isn't already starting.
Yeah. Well, he's probably got to be feeling that motivation. I mean, you're at risk for, at this point, you with guys who are younger than you, if they're playing more minutes, if that transpires, you could see the transfer in that situation, especially today's game, right?
You could, and I think but even beyond that, I think it's just about winning games. The one thing I would say positively from a Purdue perspective for sure is that you look at their backcourt group compared to where it was heading into the season 2 years ago, where they essentially had to play Smith and Lawyer because they had no other options. It's so much improved over that it's gone from something that you thought about as a question mark to a clear strength of the team, in my opinion.
Yeah.
That they've got 4 guys, at least 4 guys who you can feel really good about.
Next, we'll talk about Caleb Furst, 6'10", 230-pound senior. He averaged 2.2 points a game, 2.4 rebounds a game in 9 minutes. He shot 44, 27, and 68.
Yeah, Caleb Furst, is, I'm sure at least some of our listeners remember, is a guy from Fort Wayne that Michigan State recruited very hard.
Right.
I think they thought at one point they might have him. And he started his career at Purdue very well. He had a very good freshman season. And even a little bit into his sophomore year, was still starting, was still playing a significant role. And then the bottom just fell out. And you look at where he's at now as a junior, only 9 minutes a game. He hasn't been able to find his three-point shot again, which was good early and has not been really since then. I mean, 27% from 3 is not quite as good as you would hope for. And essentially, you could say he lost his role in the rotation to Kaufman-Renn last year. So I don't understand why. He clearly last year looked like a guy who was just struggling to find any kind of confidence. And sometimes that can just feed on itself. You're so desperate to show what you can do that you start trying to do things that you can't really do, and it doesn't work. And that leads to even lower levels of confidence, which leads to you trying to do even more. And you see what happens. Mm-hmm. It's the unvirtuous cycle. And it's really weird because, man, I honestly, I thought this guy was going to be a Matt Costello who got to a higher level of play quicker than Matt did. Like, I thought as a sophomore, he might be approximately what Matt was as a senior. That's how good I thought he could be. And it's just gone the other direction. So this is his last go around. I will admit, I was surprised he didn't transfer out.
Yeah, right. Compared to Gillis, right? You'd expect him versus Gillis.
Yeah. But even with Gillis leaving, I still thought he would go, because I think even with Gillis gone, you look at this roster, you say, well, is it a given that Caleb Furst is going to play a bigger role? I don't know that it is. I think he's going to have a chance. But to me, it's unclear how big that opportunity is. So I was surprised to not see him look to start over somewhere else. But credit to him, and I guess credit to Matt Painter, that Furst felt strongly enough about the program to stick it out.
Then we have 7'2", 260-pounder Will Berg, who took a redshirt year last year. He's a sophomore. He averaged 2.6 points a game, 1.9 rebounds a game in very limited minutes. So, this is, I guess, one of the obvious possibilities as far as replacing at the 5 and replacing Edey.
Yeah, I think one of 2 guys will start, and Berg will have an opportunity. And, we haven't seen enough. We don't know. But I at this point, I'm done thinking that a guy can't be effective growing into a role over time at that size at Purdue. So I'm going to assume that Berg at least has the potential to be an effective player. But effective is a broad and very generic term. I'm not talking about what I would be shocked by is to see him anywhere near the level that Zach Edey was at, but he doesn't have to be a positive contributor for Purdue. So as the cliche goes, you can't teach size, and he's got a lot of it at 7'2" and 260. I would guess, and I'm guessing here, but I would guess a bigger challenge for him probably would seem to be conditioning. You would assume
that size,
but we'll see. I expect him to play. I just don't know how big the role's going to be.
Yeah, Mike, I bet you Matt Painter's in the same boat as you. Sort of how he holds up and stuff through the season.
Yeah.
Final player is Brian Waddell, 6'7" junior, average 1.1 points a game, very limited minutes. hard to imagine him having much expansion role without a lot of injuries or something happening, I think.
Yeah, and he's a legacy guy. His father was Matt Waddell, who played in the early 90s, I believe, for Gene Cady. He was kind of a late addition. He was to their class when he came to Purdue. He was a guy who it was kind of touch and go as to whether he would get an offer, and then he finally did, and he ended up going there. Hasn't been able to break through, and I think when you look at the guys in front of him, it's hard to imagine his role expanding very much, but we'll see how it goes.
All right, that finally brings us to the newcomers, brought to you by the Brothers Adjust Your Gutters. If you need gutter work, and let's be honest, if you have a house, you need gutters, or if you have a business, you need to make sure you have gutters, and you have to have proper removal of the water away from the side of your house or your building, because when it gets in there, it causes all sorts of trouble. I know I've talked about the show plenty of times, all the problems I had with my gutters. I didn't even know I had problems in my front door, but I was just commenting to my wife just last night. I said, it is so nice. I do not have to stain and reseal my front door. It's been 2 years now. It's still just as nice as it was before. I'd always assumed it was the sun. Turns out it was just the water. So now that I have gutters, I get to move it away, and I don't have to sand down my door in July and then restain it, which, let me tell you, is a pain in the butt. So contact the Brothers Adjust Your Gutters. They only do gutters, and so they're really good at it. They can either repair them, replace them. They can put leaf guards on, whatever you need done, big job or small job, they will do it. 10% off to listen to the show if you mention Final Four when you get your estimate. You can find ways to reach out to them at our support page. The Final Four is on theschedule.com/support. Contact them today. You'll be glad you did. So first newcomer is, of course, my son, who is at Purdue this year, 5'9", $135. I don't think he'll see much playing time. He's probably going to spend most of his time in the engineering dorms. So we'll move on to the other newcomers. Jakari Harris, 6'3" guard from Georgia. He was a top 100 guy nationally and a shooter. So, I guess the question with a lot of these guys is, especially with him, is, how much time is he going to see in the court? I would imagine not a whole lot, just because of how crowded it is at the backcourt.
Possibly, but I would say I have seen early word out of Purdue suggesting that they really like him. And the other thing that I think gives him a chance is they're going to need somebody to play point guard minutes when Smith needs a blow.
Sure.
Which it probably isn't a lot, but it's probably, you would figure,
8 minutes,
6 to 8 minutes a night. Yeah. And unlike last year where they had Lance Jones who could do that, there really isn't, among returnees, none of those other guys. Those are all really wings. So I think there's a possible job just in that for Jakari Harris. Top 100 guy, so solid recruit. Purdue doesn't, I don't know how well people understand this, but Matt Painter's classes don't typically, over the course of his tenure there, it's not like Michigan State, where if Michigan State takes a guy from outside the top 100, that's rare. Usually the vast majority of the guys they land are at least top 100 recruits. Hasn't always been that way at Purdue, but Jakari Harris is that kind of guy. So I think he's got a real chance to earn some backup point guard minutes and then maybe some minutes off the ball as well. He does have a reputation as a strong shooter. I think defensive progress will also likely be big for him in terms of how big his role happens to be.
All right, so the next newcomer is one who will challenge Will Berg, I think, for that 5 spot. Daniel Jacobson, 7'3", 230-pound center. He has played with Team USA under 18, so he definitely has some high-level experience. And as I mentioned, I think he's obviously going to be in the competition for that starting role.
A really interesting story. I remember seeing this kid play, and I'm pretty sure he was on the opposing team against Cohen Carr. And it was Cohen Carr's senior year, so it was after he committed to Michigan State. And Jacobson was on the opposing team, so he was just a junior at that time. Mm-hmm. And he stood out because he was 7 foot, whatever he was that time. Maybe
hard not to stand out.
Maybe he was only 7'1" then. I don't know. But this kid just was rail thin, couldn't put much together. in this game, and I didn't think a lot about him after that. And then all of a sudden, as last year went along, his last year of high school basketball, and even the AAU season before that, you just kept hearing about the progress that this guy was making, and he was dominating high-level games. And, no surprise, Purdue found their way to him. And honestly, if you were a kid that size, where else in the country would you think about before Purdue? Maybe you might think about UConn.
Yeah.
But that's about it. So it makes perfect sense. That rapid progression continued, and over last spring rather, he ended up playing a very significant role for Team USA's under-18 group. I think the belief is that early, his size, obviously at 7'3", but he's also considered to have very good anticipation. The expectation is he will be a rim protector early, which is actually something Zach Edey really didn't do very much of until last season.
Right.
Zach Edey, despite his size, was not a big-time shot blocker, but Jacobson is seen as a guy, I think, who can make maybe more of an immediate defensive impact that way. Offensively, in time at least, they think he's a guy who, unlike most of the bigs that Purdue has had, they think he could actually potentially be a floor stretcher. I think he became very effective at the level he was playing in the post, again, because of his size. But in college, it's going to be a different story, and that's where strength is really going to determine how effective he can be offensively. So I don't know, despite a really great final year in high school, I don't know that I'm expecting him to be a major, major factor right away. I think he's going to play. He might even start. Kind of depends on where Berg is at versus him.
Right.
But I think it's going to take him some time to become the full package. But the nice thing is he's got some elements that should show up and play more or less immediately. And primarily, as I say, I think that will be on the defensive end. I would expect him to make an impact early. Offensively, we'll see how quickly it comes. But in time, if I were betting on he and Berg over the course of, say, the next 3 years, I would bet on Jacobson. I think he's probably the next great Purdue big man, but he may not be great this year.
Well, and as you'll notice, we go through these newcomers. We've got 3 more left. None of them are transfers, so it's kind of very unusual.
None.
Yep. Which is, not even Michigan State has that going for them.
Right.
So the next player is Raleigh Burgess, 6'10", 230-pound freshman, who, the same weight as Daniel Jacobson, but 5 inches shorter. To give you a little idea of his size.
I think the question with Burgess is strength and defensive progress will be what decides it in terms of if he plays a role and how big that role is. I would guess that it's between he and Caleb first. And so, you would probably bet on first because of experience, but we'll see.
Burgess is by the end of the year. Yeah.
Yeah, and Burgess is a guy they seem to be high on as somebody who could actually be a skilled big man who provides them some shooting punch.
Next, we have Jack Benner, 6'5", freshman guard, in-state product, and he's more of a 3-and-D guy.
Yeah, and he had pretty much all mid-major offers. But as I mentioned, Purdue, Matt Painter has not really made a living on high-profile guys. He's gotten a few more of them lately. Miles Colvin was kind of seen as a higher-level recruit. We mentioned, Jakari Harris, and then Daniel Jacobson really wasn't seen as a high-level guy when Purdue took him. He's grown into that, or he's seen that way now. But guys like Benter have really been the backbone of this program. They think he could be another Dakota Mathias, Sasha Stefanovic type, as you said, a 3-and-D player, good athlete, not on the Colvin level, but a good athlete. They think he can shoot, but you look at this roster, it seems like a developmental year for him. which again is something Purdue does.
Right. And Braden Smith wasn't very highly regarded either coming out of high
Not
school.
at all.
So
Not at
look
all.
what he is
Nope.
now.
And
The projected
and
top player in in Big Ten.
Frankly, Fletcher Lawyer wasn't either.
Right.
Fletcher Lawyer was not ranked as highly as his brother was. I can tell you that.
And finally, C.J. Cox, 6'2" guard from Massachusetts.
Yeah, another guy didn't have any other high major offers when he committed. Now he's a guy who has some point guard skills, but boy, unless something really goes wrong, I would just think Jakari Harris is the guy who's in line to get those backup minutes before Cox. And again, as with Benter, I would think this is a developmental year for Cox.
Okay, so I think you probably answered it earlier on, but brought to you by the Brothers Just Two Gutters, which player do you think teams will have to focus on to keep in the gutter for Purdue this year?
Oh, it's got to be Braden Smith, at least early on. I mean, that's the expectation, is that he's the leader of this team. He's going to have the ball in his hands. I think he becomes their top offensive option. I mean, there's always the chance that somebody else emerges into that role, but I think he's the safest bet. And I'll say this, whether he is that or someone else emerges as the top scorer, I don't think there's any question Braden Smith is the most important guy for this team.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be a very interesting year for Purdue. I mean, they finally got the monkey off their back, got it, flushed away the memories of the first round loss in the tournament, went all the way to the title game. No longer have Edey, but they certainly have a very intriguing team, lots of different parts and pieces that look like they could be very successful, just a different team than last year, obviously. You still have them projected to win, which would be back-to-back Big Ten titles. I don't remember the last team that did that.
I do.
What colors does they wear?
Yeah. Familiar ones.
Yeah. But it's been a while since someone's done that, I think, right? I mean, when did we say do that last?
2020.
Oh,
not
I guess
that long ago.
Shows my short-term memory problems, I guess. So
yeah,
you just get so used to the success at Michigan State, you get spoiled by it. Like, you're
right.
like, yeah, we just won another Big Ten title. But what did you do in the tournament?
That's true. Yeah, it's not that long ago, but it's it would still be a very impressive thing. I will say this: I'm very close. I'm not going to say exactly as strongly do I feel this way, but if you remember 2 years ago, I picked Indiana first, but I said they're not going to win it.
You picked them their second this year, and you said they're not going to be a second.
I'm very close to saying that about this Purdue team. I'm not going to go that far. And what that is, more than anything else, is the difference in my level of respect for Matt Painter versus Mike Woodson.
Sure.
But I think this. There's no way. I will be absolutely floored if Purdue comes out, or anybody in this Big Ten, not just Purdue, comes out and just laps the field the way Purdue has the last 2 years.
Yeah.
I cannot. If there will not be much that would be shocking in a league like the Big Ten this year, because as we've spent a lot of time talking about, you have such a difficult job to try to discern the differences between so many of these teams, because there's so many questions, so much roster turnover, and so many teams that it's very difficult to set out a definitive pecking order, right? But the one thing that would absolutely shock me is anybody just going out there and winning 17 or 18 games in the league.
Yeah.
I just do not think we're going to see that. And so could Purdue win it again? Absolutely. And that's why I've got them here, is because they've got experience, and they have the second best coach in the Big Ten. And you also, this needs to be said, when half of your games in the league are going to be played at Mackey Arena, that's also a nice place to be.
Sure.
That gives you a nice feeling of comfort that, all right, we've got a real advantage in those home games. It's going to be difficult for anyone to overcome. And that puts you a leg up on a lot of other people. So a lot of reasons to like this team. I think that you start, as I mentioned, with the guard play. That all of a sudden is turned now. And I think particularly if Jakari Harris steps up as a freshman and is playable and is solid, then you've really got something. Then you are 5 deep at those 3 guard spots. And I think it's clearly the strength of this team coming into the season is guard play. You got a lot of guys who look like they could have very, very good seasons. And, you combine with that, they've obviously still got a ton of size. I mean, you've got what? I think we just listed off 4 players 6'10" and above.
Yeah.
On the roster, and that's not counting Kaufman-Wren, who's 6'9",
right.
and might be their best, I think is their best post scorer. So there's a lot to work with for Matt Painter. But you do have legitimate questions, which is, okay, you like their guards, but how well do those guys fare without Zach Edey to suck up so much attention? The counter to that is that you've now got 2 juniors leading the way.
Yep.
And then 2 sophomores along with them who got experience last year would seem to be ready to take another step forward. So that experience is going to be helpful. I think my bottom line is, in a Big Ten that looks very wide open, I don't think it's ever a bad idea to put your money on guard play and coaching. And Purdue checks both of those boxes. So that's why I've got them where I've got them. But as I said, I am not expecting Purdue to go run away and hide from the rest of the league or anybody else to do that. I would be very surprised if we see that. I think it's going to be a highly competitive year throughout the league and probably a very tight finish at the top of the conference.
Yeah, I think there's little questions. There's going to be a lot of clumping of teams. And I think, the other thing that we can't account for, and I don't think anyone could. I mean, you could go through and say who plays who twice and who just plays, on the road here.
Yeah.
You can go through that. And, I think you could maybe ferret something out, get maybe a better idea. However, we don't really have an idea, let's say 16 through 6, like how these teams are really going to be, right? Or maybe 16 through 7.
Yep.
So, is a trip to Minneapolis can be really bad or super easy, or, like going to Oregon or USC. I mean, there's just there are too many variables. Also, there's the travel. You're going to have to play 2 games out on the West Coast. The West Coast teams have to play East Coast. Is that going to affect them? Is it not going to affect them? Who knows, right? And so the way any sort of prediction, outside of yours, which is of course spot on, we assume that, but it's it's going to be pretty impossible. That's why it's just kind of fun. It's almost like it's almost like picking the tournament, right? Like you have a vague idea, but you don't have any idea, even if you know the matchups, how a team's going to prepare that day, right? So it makes it certainly very interesting. And just to recap everything, obviously, if you've been paying attention, you recognize that Michigan State, Rod has projected as 5th. His picks right now from bottom to top are Minnesota, Washington, Northwestern, Penn State, Iowa, Wisconsin, USC, Nebraska, Oregon, Maryland, Rutgers, Michigan, Ohio State, Michigan State, Illinois, UCLA, Indiana, and Purdue. So if you think you can do better, again, send an email to me, enter the drawing for $100 in Nudge Printing apparel. And it's not too long, but the season will get underway and we'll get into our big deep dive for Michigan State. We're a team that I think is very intriguing as well as Purdue, with a lot of interesting pieces. And I don't know, it'll be fun talking about the Spartans after talking about all these Big Ten teams, the other teams. It'll be nice to talk about the green and white.
I think talking about the scheduling, I think that's absolutely true. It's ridiculous to do too much thinking about the impact of scheduling at this stage. One thing I will say, though, in Michigan State's favor, since we're going to finally turn to the main event with our next and final preview, if I remember correctly, and I'm looking at this
no Mackey this year
right now as I speak. Well, definitely no Mackey. I know that.
They have home and away with Illinois, Minnesota, and Michigan.
Okay. But I think, if memory serves, and sorry, I'm struggling.
They're not going to Assembly Hall either. They're not going to the state of Indiana.
That's right. That was the other one.
Yep.
So if I'm right, and Purdue and Indiana are the 2 best teams, that is, I think, and again, the nature of those buildings, particularly Mackey, that is, at least on the surface as of now, would appear to be an advantage for Michigan State. to not be facing either of those teams on the road. Beyond that, the impact of who they play at home, who they play on the road, I think for everybody, as you said, it's ridiculous because what's the real difference between 6 and 16 at this stage? I don't think you can know that. We just don't have enough information to accurately get a read on that. You know, I've had to make picks because we're going to present these teams, and that's kind of what you do. But, you know, it used to be that I would have very strong opinions about that. I don't in this environment. I don't know how anybody can. You know, it is, I will note, it is funny though, the Big Ten, the preseason poll that I saw had the same top 5 that I did. I don't recall whether it was in exactly the same order, but it was the same group of 5. So that makes me feel at least a little bit better that, and believe it or not, listeners, I swear to you, I made these. When did I made these picks.
I think we started these previews sometime in February.
July?
I'm not sure.
No, it was like late July.
Yeah,
it was late July. I think that I put these together and put them in order. So that did make me feel good that at least I was seeing it more or less the same way as others who try to do this. But hey, they're not likely going to be right, and neither am I. So,
no. Well, I mean, I think, you know, last year, clearly, you put your picks in first, and the people who put them in last had much better outcomes than you. I mean, you ended up in last place. But again, you know, you said, yeah. I don't want to bring it up too many times, but I mean, you had to pick it again in July. You hadn't seen anybody play. By the time December rolls along, you've seen November. You have some vague idea of what these teams are like. Are they totally dysfunctional?
Right.
As this team, they're surprising.
I will note this year, I would still not feel comfortable if I was picking in. When is our deadline? Is it early December?
I think the first Michigan State game is December 3rd, so I imagine I have to look at the schedule, but it's December 1st or 2nd, let's say.
Yeah. So I still wouldn't feel very comfortable this year.
No.
With thinking that I had it dialed in after seeing November unfold, because I especially with the way things are now, because you look so many of these teams that we've talked about, and Purdue is an exception to this, obviously, but you look at USC, you look at Michigan, both of those teams, huge roster turnover and a new coach. So the idea that what they are in November is going to give you an indication as to what they're likely to be in February is not very likely.
Yeah.
Illinois has the coach back, but again, massive roster turnover. And you can go on and on and on around the league, and you will find this. So where teams are going to be in February, I just don't think November or even December is likely to tell you a hell of a lot. You'd obviously rather be looking good in those early months, but I don't think it's a guarantee that you're going to be at the same spot come February, you know, and vice versa.
Tough luck. You got to make your decision by early December. So you guys will have to get your entries in by then for an opportunity to win. Enjoy the contest. All right. So we'll wrap it up there. We'll come back to you next with the Michigan State Deep Dive season preview. So until next time, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go Green.